I'll holler at your boy, it's Red Dice Diaries here with another RPG review. This time I'm going to be reviewing Dark Albion, The Rose War. Okay, so in this RPG review, as I've said, I'm going to be reviewing Dark Albion, The Rose War, a grim fantasy OSR supplement set in a loose version of 15th century England. The author is Kazimir Urbanski, otherwise known as the RPGPundit. I'll put a link to his excellent blog in the description of the video down below. The genre is a sort of dark quasi-historical fantasy, as I was saying, and the book is 275 pages. The interior is black and white, and it's a hardback. DrivethruRPG, and again I'll put a link in the description down below. Now, I came to be reviewing this book when I saw it mentioned in a Google Plus community. It was touted as a dark fantasy OSR book based on England in the 15th century, and particularly the War of the Roses. Given that I'm currently running a Lamentations of the Flame Princess campaign using the Middlelands setting but with an English Civil War feel, I decided to pick up a copy of the book to see if I could mine it for potential ideas. The game uses D&D style OSR rules and was originally written with Lamentations of the Flame Princess in mind, although it will be very, very easy to use with other OSR games. Now, if you're new to my video reviews, I give a rating at the start of the video and a short summary so that anyone pressed for time can just watch this little bit. For people interested in a more detailed breakdown, that will follow after the rating. So to determine the rating, each category is rated either a plus, a blank, or a minus. At the end of it, the four categories are added up, and that gives me a rating which I base on the Fate ladder, which, if you're familiar with a Fate RPG, you'll know about. Otherwise, you just need to know a bigger number is better. It'll all be explained in a little bit anyway. Okay, so for writing, I'm going to give the book a plus. The writing of the book is matter of fact, cramming in an awful lot of information and detail, but without being overly flamboyant. It feels like a tightly focused product, where the author is trying to relay the maximum amount of information to us and give us a book that is cram-packed with value. The tone of the book also lends to this pseudo-historical vibe that the book gives off. It's almost as though you're reading a history book about things that never happened, or, if they did, in a slightly different way in real life. For the look of the book, I'm going to give it a blank. Dark Albion makes great use of public domain black and white artwork. It's not exactly the most beautiful book in the world, although the cover is excellent. I love that sort of old school style of art. But the artwork that it does have is used to break up the text to great effect. And just by flicking to a page, you can see a few examples there. Well used stuff. For system, I'm going to give it a plus. I mean, although Dark Albion isn't really a system-specific book as such, there are more than enough rules, both optional and otherwise, to keep the hungriest, rules-starved GM happy. And they're pretty much compatible with any OSR game that you could care to mention, without a great deal of conversion work being necessary. And finally, for background, I'm going to give it a plus. I've always enjoyed the faux medieval vibe, and the War of the Roses is a particularly interesting period, full of shifting alliances, betrayal, political scheming, and plots to take the throne. Dark Albion conveys a feeling of the time period and the events occurring without ever feeling too preachy or like it is pointing at a blackboard and drilling you through a history class at school. So, as I've said, these four ratings are added up to get an overall rating between -4 and +4. The rating is then given based on the standard Fate ladder, which you can see there. So adding them up, the overall rating I'm going to give Dark Albion is a +3, which, as you can see on the Fate ladder, is a good rating. If you have the slightest interest in the medieval period, the War of the Roses, and you want a book that is going to provide you with all the information you need to run a game set in that period, you will get an awful lot out of Dark Albion. Although most of the rules information is clearly designed for OSR games, the historical and setting details would be useful for running a game in this time period, regardless of the system being used. I highly recommend you pick up a copy if you even have the slightest interest in this historical period. Okay, so there's my rating, so I'm going to move on to the more detailed review now. We start off this book with the introduction, and it begins by laying out the author's aims for the book, citing his love of the Lamentations of the Flame Princess rules, but his different feelings on tone to the system's author. Inspired by George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones and some of the historical conflicts behind them, he decided to create a fantasy version of that world with a gritty, dark style. Personally, I can sympathise with the author's feelings about Lamentations of the Flame Princess. I'm also a lover of the system, but the overall tone, particularly in some of the more extreme supplements, doesn't really jive well with me. I'm not offended by them at all. It just doesn't gel with my style of GMing. Although I'm not a fan of Game of Thrones, the TV series, or A Song of Ice and Fire, the book series. I mean, the last thing that George R.R. Martin worked on that I liked was the series Beauty and the Beast. I do love a setting based around mythical England, both because it's familiar to me and because there's a very rich history of myths and legends, not to mention a tightly woven tapestry of actual history that can be drawn upon to produce great role-playing fodder. The author goes on to describe that he wanted to do for England what old Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay did for Germany. This is a laudable aim. I'm very much a fan of the older pre-Fantasy Flight game, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So let's dive in and just see what we have in this lovely book. The introduction rounds off with 6 pages of information outlining things the GMs and players should keep in mind when running a Dark Albion campaign, particularly in areas that may differ from more traditional OSR games. These passages cover things as social status, very important in history, but often given faint, if any, treatment in RPGs, the role of women, magic and religion, chaos cults, and non-humans. We then move on to the Gazetteer of Albion with this lovely map here that you can see. And a gazetteer will be a familiar thing to any old school GMs who run their own campaigns. Generally, it's a document that contains world background, NPC information, and anything else that will help the PCs create characters and allow the GM to run the actual game. The Gazetteer begins with an overview of Albion, the game's version of a dark fantasy England, explaining that Mad Henry VI is now on the throne, and the realm is being torn apart by the conflict between the royal family, the Lancastrians, and their cousins of the York family, led by the charismatic Richard of York, a popular war hero. Richard claims to be the rightful king of Albion, having a better claim than the Lancastrians, who usurped the throne 50 years previous. Currently, the realm is in a very tense period, as parties vie to either prevent war between the Lancastrians, the Red Rose, and the Yorks, the White Rose, or to stir up conflict between them. The realm stands on a knife edge between peace and a devastating civil war. We then have, as we flick through the book, a small section on religion that starts here, with the Church of the Unconquered Sun being a version of the Catholic or Christian faith, and various pagan precursor religions getting a very brief mention. We also see our first peek of the chaos cults here, a forbidden religion worshipped by savage Pict tribes and various inhuman worshippers. At this point, it seems as though the game is dividing pagans into 2 camps: the good pagans, the followers of the old faith of Albion, and the bad pagans, the evil followers of chaos. Whatever you think about this, I was pleased to see the inclusion of dark chaos worshippers. It helps give the game that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay-esque feeling, and it's always good to have some rationale for evil cults and temples in OSR games. The social ramifications of magic are touched on a little here. Essentially, sorcery and witchcraft is punishable by death, but religious devotion or just plain old bags of money can disguise arcane talent as either divine miracles or studious science, allowing the discreet and rich practitioner to get away with it. We learn that in the default Dark Albion setting, there is only limited ethnical diversity. Black powder technology is in its infancy, Fae lurk beyond the normal world, and undead are uncommon. The Gazetteer then goes on to describe some of the more prominent regions in the setting, including London, which we get a nice black and white map of, and a write-up of the most important locations in the city. The various region write-ups are nice and clear. Thankfully, there's not a lot of naff flavour text. The author's choosing to concentrate on stuff that you can use in your game. For example, we discover that there are two main groups outside of the political structure that hold power in London. The livery companies, organised by trade guilds, and the London mob, spontaneous outpourings of violence led by agitators. These are described in less than 2 pages, but a large amount of information is covered in that space. The Gazetteer section and the book as a whole are scattered with black and white artwork, some of it in a woodcut style. I presume it's public domain art, but it works really well given the game's semi-historical background. There are also a number of nice black and white hex maps. Whilst they aren't gorgeous full colour maps, they are very clear and they do a beautiful job of showing the relative locations of various towns and natural features. So, if we move forward in the book, oh, and I can see one of the hex maps there. I'll just show you a quick peep at that so you can see what I'm talking about when I say that they're lovely black and white clear maps. All the information you need on them without being unduly cluttered. Carry on flicking through. Like I say, there's an awful lot of detail in the book covering all the various different places in this version of the UK. Our next section is called Kingdoms of the Continent, and as you might expect, this focuses on the various areas outside of the UK, and we get this beautiful black and white world map showing the makeup of the various countries as they are portrayed in this setting. Great stuff, covering a double page. Now, in the area where France would be on a modern day map, it's occupied by the Kingdom of Frogland in the Dark Albion setting, a realm of chaotic amphibian-like humanoids who clearly take at least a bit of inspiration from the mainly British stereotype of French people. It's a staple of OSR games to poke fun at or make tongue-in-cheek references to aspects of real life, so this didn't really come as a surprise, although the frogmen don't seem particularly well developed at this point, beyond being a little in-joke, although I'm sure individual GMs could elevate them into something more interesting. Still, it's possible further development might occur later. Reading this section has enough information to feel like the author has done their research to give it the ring of authenticity, although it is an obviously fantasised version of the world, without making the supplement into a dry, dusty school textbook. In particular, I found the 3 or 4 paragraphs on the Hanseatic League, a collection of city-states and allied market towns along the Baltic coast, extremely interesting. There's an awful lot of useful adventure fodder in this chapter. We then move on to the next section called Law and Justice in Albion. And as you might expect, it deals with the legal system in this campaign world. Quite sensibly, the author recommends that the actual trials be handled through role-playing rather than just a series of dice rolls. As was the case in real-world history, Albion has 2 different types of law, ecclesiastical law and secular law. There's not a great deal of difference between them, save that ecclesiastical or church law tends to be less harsh if the criminal shows signs of sincere repentance. There's a handy list of common punishments for crimes and the level of fines in pounds, shillings and pence, of course, which I think would be very useful for quick reference during a game when player characters inevitably commit crimes. The next section is called the History of Albion. And as a bit of a disclaimer, let me start this section by saying that I am not, nor am I ever likely to be, a huge history buff. I've got an interest in it, in the sense that I believe the past informs the present and the future, but I lack the memory prowess to remember the bewildering array of dates, events, and personalities that have shaped human history thus far. However, that hasn't stopped me running a number of pseudo-historical games, although I always try and make them enjoyable games first and worry about historical accuracy later, if at all. So, this chapter covers the history of Albion and begins wisely, in my opinion, by giving a short summary of the lands of Albion in the present day of the campaign, giving us information concerning the dark omens that beset the world, an unusually harsh winter, a rebellion in Burgundia, war in Scotsland, and the fall of Old Byzantium to the forces of the Turk. Meanwhile, in Albion, Richard of York pushes his claim to the throne, and the whole realm teeters on the very brink of war. This is a great introduction to a campaign, regardless of how accurate or inaccurate it may be. This is the sort of stuff that you could really sell to players to get them interested in running a game using this campaign. Hell, just say the earlier paragraph in a gravelly voice, and it could be the introduction to any one of a number of pseudo-historical action films. Following this is a short history of Albion, covering a broad strokes version of English history, splitting it into the following sections, each of which gets a couple of paragraphs. There's prehistory, early history, the Arcadian invasion, the Dark Time, conquest, and modern history. The modern history section covers the present day of the default setting, roughly equivalent to the 15th century England, and makes the interesting decision to tell this part of the history by providing details on the most prominent figures that were around at the time, from St. Richard the Lionheart to Henry VI, the Mad King. It may be that the author decided to go this route because they didn't wish to impose a set path of events on players, but I love this because it's the characters and personalities of history that I find most interesting, since human motivations and desires tend to be behind some, if not all, of the most memorable historical events, in my opinion. We then have a future history of Albion, where a brief timeline of events, as they occurred in history, is provided. This is useful because the GM can know what path events would have taken were nothing to change in their own version of the campaign. But the author is at pains to point out that the GM is not obligated to stick to this version of events. Although my own Midlands game, which is very loosely based on a fantasy version of England, is set a century after the events of Dark Albion, there are definitely some bits and pieces I'll be taking inspiration from in future. So, moving on. And I apologise for the massive amount of page flipping, but as I've said, there is an awful lot of stuff in this book. So, the next chapter is titled Characters in Albion. And again, we have another lovely piece of black and white art there. Now, Dark Albion is primarily intended for use with OSR games and was originally written to be a campaign for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. This chapter offers some suggestions and tweaks for creating characters using those systems to give them a feeling more appropriate to the campaign setting. For example, there is a far greater emphasis placed in Dark Albion on social class than is traditional in many RPGs. This makes sense given the sharp class divides that were present in medieval society and, some might say, are still present today. In addition to rolling for your social class, this chapter also offers a random prior event table that players can roll on to determine something that figures in their character's backstory. There are a huge variety of events, some helpful, some harmful, and others just bizarre and bewildering, but they could all be spun potentially into interesting future plot by an inventive GM and players. For example, the PC may have suffered a great heartbreak losing their first true love or having them cruelly taken from them. Their family might be involved in a deadly feud against another, or perhaps the PC even spent time imprisoned in the fabled Tower of London. We get some recommendations on how the typical classes, fighters, clerics, rogues, magic users, barbarians, etc., can fit into a Dark Albion setting. There's not a great deal that's surprising here. Magic users tend to be educated and tolerated wise men or hunted dabblers in the darkness. Barbarians are heathen warriors, and rogues are, well, rogues. I found the setting on clerics and priests interesting, since the setting espouses a monotheistic religion who worship a deity known as the Unconquered Sun. The suggestion seems to be that spellcasting clerics will be warrior priests tasked with rooting out the enemies of the Unconquered Sun, with druids and other divine casters not existing in the default setting. Although, as the author points out, this can of course be changed by individual GMs to suit the needs of their particular campaign. There are also some tables for creating Anglish, Scots, Welsh and Cymry names. These are a nice thing to have. It's easy enough to find such things on the net, but who doesn't like random tables? I know I certainly do. So, the next chapter is called Currency and Equipment. Unlike most medieval societies, the one discussed in Dark Albion relies mainly on a barter-based economy, with only the aristocracy and the very wealthy using hard currency and land in order to facilitate their transactions. We get a brief breakdown of the exchange rate in the setting, the standard coins being the penny, the silver shilling and the gold pound. £1 equals 20 shillings, which equals 200 pence, with 1 shilling equaling 10 pence. Now, just as a bit of a note on currency, we've monkeyed around with currency a fair bit in my current Midlands game, as I'm sure my groaning players will attest to. And if I had to offer one piece of advice when it comes to currency, it would be this: make it as simple as possible. Sure, there may be a momentary feeling of authenticity that you'll get when players are counting out their shillings, their pence or whatever, but trust me, the first time you have to work out a more substantial sum of loot, unless you're great at mental arithmetic, you'll be longing for the simple exchange rates of D&D. Now, various equipment and costs of living prices are provided to finish off the chapter. I'm not sure how much use I'm going to get out of this chapter personally, since I'm happy with simpler exchange rates in games, but it's well written information and will be very useful if you're more willing to tinker with the currency than I am myself. The next chapter provides a system for managing noble houses, if such things interest your players. Essentially, this is an abstract system where the noble house is an entity and has its own ability scores. These ability scores being military power, financial power and political power. Various modifiers are applied to help determine these scores. I like the fact that during a period when the Rose War is actively being fought, any house declaring for one side or another in the conflict receives bonuses and penalties when dealing with their side or the other, nicely representing the shifting tapestry of alliances and loyalties. There is a fairly simple system included where title-holding members of a noble family can make a percentage roll based on one of the attribute scores of their houses to leverage their resources to gain an advantage in a situation. I like this because it is nice and simple, but it also allows nobles to call on backup and the additional resources to represent the array of wealth and power that they hold. There's also a nifty random table that the GM can roll on once a year to determine an event that happens to a particular house, and a list of prominent noble houses in Dark Albion. I'm just starting to build up my own version of the Rose War in our Lamentations campaign, and I may very well use this part of Dark Albion as inspiration for that, perhaps even rolling on the random event table to determine what the noble houses are doing in the background. I'll certainly be cribbing some of the noble house names. Now, my absolute favourite part of this chapter has to be the abstract mass battle section. It can be quite difficult to represent larger battles in RPGs, since traditional RPG combat rules tend to get slower and more sluggish as increasing numbers of combatants are added into the mix. Of course, you can break out the miniatures and go into full wargame mode if you like, but if, like myself, wargames aren't really your bag or you just want something quick, the abstract mass battle system offered in this chapter is a good compromise. Essentially, each army calculates the amount of military power it has, normally based on how many of their forces the various sides sent into battle. Each side rolls a d20 to judge their effectiveness, and casualties are calculated, and the military power of the two sides is adjusted. The next section is titled People of Interest, and it's a list of noteworthy people, both for the present and the future of the setting. Each of them typically gets a paragraph or so of information, along with suggestions for character classes, their allegiance in the Rose War, and any change of titles that may have occurred during their history. Based on real-world people, tweaked to fit the specifics of the Dark Albion setting, I found this section very interesting. The inclusion of the various heraldic devices, you can see one of them there, is a very cool addition. If you're planning to run a campaign based in 15th century England, or like myself, if it's even loosely based on the War of the Roses, you'll find plenty of useful game fodder in this chapter. There's also write-ups of the most prominent continental rulers and leaders, including Vlad Tepes, more famously known as Vlad Dracul or Dracula. As you might expect, the next setting, titled Sorcery and Secrets, describes dark miracles and magics in the Dark Albion setting. Although it has a far lower level of magic than you might be used to from typical OSR games. Thankfully, the setting eschews the rightfully maligned and, one hopes, now almost mythical magic item shop. This section of the book paints a picture of a land where magic is divided between practitioners living in fear of religious persecution and those whose money and influence permits them to represent themselves as scholars, maintaining a reasonable degree of safety whilst they practice their arts. There are a couple of lists for spells for magic users and clerics, offering suggestions as to the spells that are appropriate to the setting, and some interesting guidelines concerning researching and learning new spells. These rules are fairly useful and could be used in pretty much any OSR game, but they pale a bit next to my favourite bit of this section, the rules for demon summoning. It's a simplified system involving the cost for certain ritual preparations, modifiers based on the rank of the demon being summoned, commoner to king, and various other bits allowing magic users to summon and attempt to bind denizens of hell. The attributes of the summoned demon are determined by a combination of their rank and a number of powers chosen by the GM. These powers range from the ability to bless a harvest to far greater powers like assassinating a king. This part of the book rounds off with guidelines for creating magic items and alchemical agents. Again, these are pretty much compatible with most OSR systems, and if you're after some more guidance rather than hand-waving these details, these systems will be very useful in your game. One of the characters in my Lamentations Midlands game is learning the herbalist arts from an ancient sage, and I'll certainly be taking inspiration from the elixir preparation rules from this book in the near future. We then move on to a chapter titled Adventuring in Albion. It covers travel and encounters in the wilderness of Dark Albion, providing chances of encounters on numerous terrain types and a D100 table of encounters that you might have on Albion's roads, to name only one of the many tables in this part of the book. In case you've not gathered by now, I am a big fan of random tables. They're great for those moments when PCs do something unexpected or decide to naff off somewhere that you hadn't planned for. You can't have too many random tables, in my opinion, and I'll probably be stealing a number of these for use in my own campaign. The chapter doesn't only cover the wilderness and roads, though. There are also tables for encounters in towns and villages. The section rounds off with a number of adventures that can be run in the setting. I don't want to go into too much detail about these, since I don't want to spoil them for you if you're planning on playing or running them, but all the adventures come with maps and are perfectly serviceable introductions to adventuring in the campaign world of Dark Albion. Finally, the book wraps up with 3 appendices. The first of these provides details on an organisation called the Knights of the Star, a secret order founded by King Edward III, who ruled Albion for over 50 years. This knightly and clerical order has connections to the current Mad King and is shrouded in mystery and secrecy. Appendix 2 provides some house rules designed to be used with lighter OSR games, such as Lamentations and Swords and Wizardry, and it suggests beginning players start at level 0, instead of first level, as is more common in a good portion of OSR games. There is also an alternate levelling up system suggested, where instead of increasing skills and abilities steadily as levels rise, the PCs get to either roll twice or choose one result from a benefits table. This is an interesting alternative to the normal method of advancements in OSR games and would, in my opinion, make characters a little bit more individual without adding significant complexity. There are a few additional classes such as Scotsmen, Kimri and Sages, some optional weapons and armour rules, and some suggestions for alternate spellcasting. Some of these optional rules are very interesting and I'd love to give them a bit of a run out in future games. The final appendix offers rules and conversions for the Fantastic Heroes and Witchery OSR game. I don't really have any experience of this game, but the appendix looks interesting enough. So, in conclusion, as I said at the start of this review, I am a massive, massive fan of this book. It has that old school feel to it, feeling like a book you've discovered from an earlier period of role-playing history, but incorporating many of the lessons learned as role-playing trends have moved forward. The author has obviously spent a lot of time playing this game and polishing up the campaign setting. It has enough of a ring of history to it to lend it something of an authentic air without being intimidating to those of us who don't have a history degree. As I said at the beginning of this review, if you're interested in running a game set in a medieval 15th century version of England or any point around this time period, or you're interested in running a game that involves civil war, competing noble houses, the War of the Roses, grab yourself a copy of this book. You will not be disappointed. So I hope you've enjoyed this RPG review of Dark Albion, the Rose War by RPGPundit. Until I see you next time, take care, and whatever you're playing, happy gaming.